this is a special study into how to count to Pentecost in the year 2001. And we're going to do some analyzing of the article by John Rittenbaugh, Countdown to Pentecost 2001. What we need to understand is this, is that there are special ways that we need to handle the Word of God and handle the conclusions that we arrive at. Let's understand something first, very important to realize. All truth is logical, but not all logic is truth. That's why we're told here in 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, it says here, beginning in verse 14, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 14, of these things put them in remembrance, charging them before the Lord, that they strive not about words to the subverting of the hearers. And this is what happens with every false doctrine that comes along. I have yet to see a false doctrine that is not based upon the Scriptures. And how is it that you can, from the Scriptures, come up with false doctrines? Well, verse 15 tells us why. Verse 14 says, don't strive about words. Verse 15 says how you correct the problem. It says, study to show yourself approved unto God. In other words, it has to be that you come before God, you love His Word, you fear and tremble before His Word, you love God the Father, you love Jesus Christ, you love the brethren, and whatever you do then is based upon the things concerning the Word of God. And it has to be rightly, then it says, rightly show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Because if the word of truth is wrongly divided, you can come up with a wrong conclusion. When you bring your own logic and your own thinking into it, then you can come up with things which are not correct. Now that's one of the reasons that I ring the cowbell when I come to my own theories or explanations, simply because I want people to understand that that's something I'm thinking about, or that is something that I am asking a question concerning, but it is not dogma, it is not truth, from the point of view that it is doctrine. See? So I have to rightly divide the Word of God. Now what happens when it's not? Then you subvert the hearers and you take away their faith. And we see this over and over and over again. Down through the years, I've seen it never fail. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. And the leaven can be pride. The leaven can be intellectual vanity. The leaven can be going back and idolizing a man that used to be the leader of the church and what he did, and therefore what he did, as a lot of people think, what Herbert Armstrong did in the Church of God and the 18 points that he allegedly restored before he died, that's all anyone needs to know. Well, if that's the case, then what they have done, they have made Herbert Armstrong God. Do you understand how that happens? It happens this way. If everything there is to know for salvation are those 18 things, then all you have to do is learn those 18 things and you can disregard the rest of the Bible. So therefore, you put this man in place of God, and if you put a man in place of God, you make him an idol. Now, there is some very sad, as we will see, understanding drawn from this. And it shows also another thing that is important. You never, never, never get an idea in your head first, come to your conclusion, and then go into the Bible to prove it. You see, that's why in the Passover book we have the 14 rules of Bible study, and we also have a booklet on it, the 14 rules of Bible study. So what we are going to do, we are going to apply the 14 rules of Bible study. We are going to test and prove this. Now, this is not a picking at John Rittenbaugh, but it is to prove all things and hold fast to that which is good. Now, I know John Rittenbaugh. I like him very much, but it really does not surprise me that something like this has come up. So let's begin to understand what the problem is. Now, simply defined it as this. In certain years, the Passover falls on the regular weekly Sabbath. And sometimes it's a rare occurrence, and other times it kind of comes in bunches. Now, according to the calculated Hebrew calendar, let's begin in 1949 is when they had when the Passover fell on a regular weekly Sabbath. Then again in 1954. Well, in Worldwide Church of God in 1954, they had only about 3,000 members. And at that time, they kept the counting of Pentecost, but also with a Monday count. They kept it beginning with the first day of the week after the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And very few people even understood that there may be a problem at that particular time because the church was so small. Now then, it did not occur again until 1974, and at that time they had thousands and thousands in the church. And between 54 and 74, then the, how should we say, the verbal doctrine came down that the Sabbath from which you begin to count to Pentecost must always fall in the days of unleavened bread. Now we're going to see that that is not necessarily always true. Whenever you have the Passover falling on a weekly Sabbath, then it's just a little bit different, and we will see why. And we will see the biblical example which tells us why. Now here are the following years that they had for the remainder of the 20th century. 76, which was then 2 years later, 86, 10 years later, 94, then which is 8 years later, and now again in 2001. Then through all of the 21st century, it falls this way. In 2005, in 2008, then it jumps clear up to 2021. Then again, 4 years later, 2025, then we have another 20-year period from 2025 to 2045. Now, if time goes on through the whole of this century to the end of it, which it doesn't look like it will, but if it does, this is how it would fall. Then again, 2048, 2052, then it jumps again for 20 years. 2072, then 2075 and 2079. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times in 100 years. So that's roughly between 9 and 10 year average that it happens. But when you have those two 20-year periods, your average is a little bit distorted when you try and average it out. So that's why it becomes a problem when it arises this way. Now let's go back and let's see the command of Leviticus 23. What I want to do first is go through and present what the Bible has and present the truth so we know and understand it, and then we can examine the claims in the article by John Rittenbaugh and understand whether it stands the test of the biblical truth or not. So let's begin here in Leviticus 23 and verse 9. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you be come into the land. which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath the priest shall wave it. Now we've always said that, especially during that 20-year period, and I remember that very well, that the Sabbath always has to fall within the days of unleavened bread. However, when the Passover falls on the regular Sabbath, the first holy day is on Sunday, the last holy day is on the weekly Sabbath. So you do not have a Sabbath within the days of unleavened bread from which to count. Now let's read and see what it says here in the Shocking Bible. The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say to them, When you enter the land that I'm giving you, and you harvest its harvest. Now it says in the King James, when you reap the harvest thereof. So it's important to understand its harvest. We'll come back to that in just a minute. You are to bring the premier sheaf of your harvest to the priest. Now that's the very first sheaf that is cut. He is to elevate the sheaf before the presence of the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow of the Sabbath, ha-Shabbat, meaning the regular weekly Sabbath, the priest is to elevate it. And then it tells the sacrifices that are to be given on this day. Now let's look at it from the translation from Owen's Analytical Hebrew. Okay? It says the same thing. Its harvest. Now, what yes, that's all I have there. Those are the same. Now then, let's analyze this just a little bit. Because the claim is made that the Israelites had to harvest their own harvest. In other words, they had to plant it before they could harvest it. Now, it doesn't say that. Let's go back and see exactly what this says. When you come into the land, so that's the first thing. Number one, when did they come into the land? Now, when they came into the land, whose land was it? It belonged to the children of Israel because God gave it to them. And when they came into the land, which is in the spring of the year, which we will see, and there is a harvest that is standing there, whose harvest is it? When there's a field of barley standing there, or many fields of barley, whose harvest is it then when it's harvested? It's the harvest of the children of Israel, because it's theirs. The planting of it does not contaminate it. Now we'll see a little later on that he mixes up another verse where a Gentile is not to handle the sheaf when it's brought to the temple. But that's different from when the Israelites would cut it. Okay? So we need to understand that it doesn't say that you must harvest your harvest that you have planted. But when you come in and take possession of it, it then becomes your harvest. That's why it says here a little later, and you shall bring the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave it before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath shall the priest wave it. Now, let's go to the book of Joshua, because there are many different claims that John Rittenbaugh makes concerning when this took place. So let's first of all find out exactly what it does say. That way we can understand what it does not say. Now let's follow this along here. Let's come to Israel going in the land. Let's come to Deuteronomy, the first chapter first. Deuteronomy, the first chapter, so we get an understanding of the time setting, so we realize what is taking place. Okay, Deuteronomy 1 and verse 1. These be the words which Moses spoke unto all Israel on this side of Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain, over against the Red Sea, and then it lists all of them. These are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke unto the children of Israel concerning all that the Lord had given in commandment unto them. Now it shows when they came in, and after he had slain Shihol, king of the Amorites, which dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, which dwelt at Ashtaroth in Edred, on this side of Jordan. In other words, they were on the east side of the Jordan River. When it says this side of Jordan, it means on the east side. And so then began Moses to declare this law, saying, so they came in, and they entered the land, took possession of the eastern part, this side of the Jordan, on the first day of the 11th month. Now, when you count to Passover, what do you have now? Let's figure this out. You have got the 11th month, which has 30 days. You have the 12th month, which has 30 days. So you have 60 days. Then from there to the Passover, you have another 2 weeks. So you've got approximately 10 weeks. Now we're going to see that's plenty of time to do the things that they needed to do. Now let's come all the way to the end of Deuteronomy. Let's come to Deuteronomy 31, and let's see some more timing if we can understand exactly what it's saying. Deuteronomy 31, and let's begin right here in verse 1. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 1. And Moses went and spoke all these words unto all Israel, and he said to them, I am 120 years old this day. I can no more go out and come in. Also the Lord has said unto me, you shall not go over this Jordan. The Lord your God, he will go over before you, and he will destroy the nations from before you, and you shall possess them. And Joshua, he shall go over before you, as the Lord has said. And the Lord shall do unto them as he did to Shiloh and to Og, the kings of the Amorites, and unto the land of them whom he destroyed. And the Lord shall give them up before your faces, that you may do unto them according to all the commandments that I have commanded you. Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he it is that goes with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you. And then he called Moses forward, called Joshua forward, and commissioned him to do as God had instructed him. Now then, let's come over here to Deuteronomy 32 and verse 45. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 45. This is after he was concluding everything he had to say. And he said unto them, set your hearts unto all the words which I testify among you this day, which you shall command your children to observe to do, all the words of this law. For it is not a vain thing for you, because it is your life. Now we need to understand that too, brethren. The words of God that we have are our life. That's why Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life. That's why he is also called the Word of God. So you combine it all together. See, it's not vain to follow the Lord. Though this thing, and through this thing, you shall prolong your days in the land where you go over to Jordan to possess it. And the Lord spoke unto Moses that selfsame day, saying, get you up into Mount Abarim, unto Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, which is over against Jericho, and behold, that is, go observe the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel for a possession. And die in the mount where you go up, and be gathered unto your people, as Aaron your brother died in Hor, and was gathered unto his people. Because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel, at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin, because you sanctified me not in the midst of the children of Israel, you shall not see the land. You shall see the land before you, but you shall not go in unto the land which I gave unto the children of Israel. So Moses didn't go in. Now, remember what time period we are dealing with, beginning with the first day of the 11th month. Now let's come over here to Deuteronomy 34 and verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him. Now that is, he, the Lord, buried Moses in the land of Moab over against Beth Peor, but no man knows of his sepulchre unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So we don't know how long it took him to bring this sermon, to write up all the words, to have it ready for them. But there's plenty of time within the 10 weeks for them to mourn for Moses for 30 days. Now then, we'll get into the book of Joshua, and let's begin to see how these things unfolded. Now let's begin in Joshua, the first chapter, and verse 10. Joshua 1 and verse 10. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, Pass through the host, and command the people, saying, Prepare your victuals, for within 3 days you shall pass over this Jordan, to go in to possess the land which the Lord your God gives you to possess it. And so they did. Now we have a booklet about the Wavesheaf offering, which shows about the time sequence in a little bit more detail, but we're going to jump ahead, and we're going to come to chapter 4 here, and then chapter 5. Now, chapter 2, they sent out the spies. Chapter 3, they rose up early in the morning, beginning in verse 1, and they removed from Shittim, came to Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. So within 3 days they were going to move. Then they got up and moved, and then they came here right by the river Jordan, and they lodged there. And it came to pass after 3 days that the officers went through the host, commanded the people, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then you shall remove from your place and go after it. And so God had an orderly progression of things, and they were to follow. So what happened was, beginning in verse 7, and the Lord said to Joshua, This day I will begin to magnify you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, I will be with you. You shall command the priests that bear the ark of the covenant, when they are in the brink of the water of Jordan, they shall stand in the Jordan. So they did. They stood in the Jordan, and it backed up so that all the children of Israel could pass over and cross over the Jordan. Now, let's come over here to chapter 4 and verse 14. Let's go back to verse 13. About 40,000 prepared for war passed before the Lord unto battle to the plain of Jericho. Now that's an important statement. 40,000 men prepared for war. Now let's stop and just review a little bit what happened here when we come up to this point. Remember when the children of Israel refused to go in, and God said, all right, you're going to wander 40 years in the wilderness, a year for every day that the spies were in spying out the land. And everyone who is 20 years and older are going to die in the wilderness. And so that happened. But we have a whole group of people, do we not, who were circumcised. All the males were circumcised that were from 20 years and under. So now we have with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, we have this. The oldest ones were 60 years old. 20 plus 40 is 60. The youngest ones were a little over 40, because there may have been some babies at that time who had just been born when that took place. So we've got a great number of people to where then they were the ones who all during the wilderness with the priest and the Levites were keeping the Passover at the regular time. Now, let's come over here to, yes, we're in chapter 4, and the people did that. They came over, verse 13, the 40,000 prepared for war, passed over. Verse 14 now, and on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. So then they did that. They crossed the river. Now let's notice something here, verse 19, because this becomes very important. And the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. So they came up out of the Jordan that day. What is the 10th day of the first month? Well, you go back to Exodus 12, and the children of Israel were commanded that on the 10th day of the first month, they were to select the lamb which would be for the Passover. So after they crossed over the Jordan, they selected their lamb, and now we begin to count down to the Passover. Now let's see what else happened here. Then they picked up the 12 stones, set them up, so that it would always be a standing witness that that's where the children of Israel passed over the Jordan. Now let's come to chapter 5. Let's go through this verse by verse, beginning in verse 2. And at that time the Lord said to Joshua, make you sharp knives, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. Now, we have no account in Exodus that there was a circumcision before they left the land of Egypt. But there had to be, because no one uncircumcised could partake of the Passover. So that's why it says the second time. And Joshua made him sharp knives and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of foreskins. Now we'll talk about the whole circumcision process here, because John in his paper says that it took a long time to do it. Well, no. Those men who are already circumcised were the ones who circumcised the ones who were not circumcised. And it was all done on that one day, on the 10th day of the first month. It couldn't be strung out over a long period of time, as we will see. Remember, the key is back here, that on the 10th day of the first month, that's when they came to Gilgal. Now let's go ahead. Verse 4. And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war died in the wilderness by the way after they came out of Egypt. So now we have new men of war because we read about them earlier. And these had to then be those who were already circumcised, because we will see a little bit later on that there's a distinction made between the men of war when they come to Jericho, and then later on the last day when all the children of Israel were there. Let's go on. Now, all the people that were that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way, as they came forth of Egypt, they were not circumcised. So we have two groups here. The circumcised, who at the time that the 40 years began, were under 20 years. Now, how many that is, we don't know. But it certainly was a lot if we consider that there was a million to 1.5 million people total. You had a couple of 100,000 minimum. Now, verse 6. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people that were men of war, which came out of Egypt, were consumed, because they obeyed not the words or the voice of the Lord, unto whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord swore unto their fathers, that he would give us, a land that flows with milk and honey. And their children, whom he raised up in their stead, them Joshua circumcised. For they were uncircumcised, because they had not circumcised them by the way. And it came to pass, when they had done circumcising all the people, that they abode in the places in the camp till they were whole. Now, how long does it take to be healed from circumcision? Well, number one, this doesn't tell us. Number two, we have this many days to the Passover, so let's count them. You have day 10 when they were circumcised, 11, 12, 13, 14. So to the Passover you have 5 days. Then, from there to the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you have another 7 days. So that's a total of 14 days. Now, let's go on. No, that's 5 and 7 is 12. Now, verse 9. And the Lord said unto Joshua, This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you, wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Now, verse 10 is a key, critical, important verse. 10, 11, and 12. Because these define for us from the Scriptures how a Passover and Wavesheaf offering day is counted by God when it falls on the weekly Sabbath. Now, we will see that this fell on the weekly Sabbath, because when the Passover falls on the weekly Sabbath, that is the only time when the Wavesheaf offering is waved on the day after the Passover, because it falls on the weekly Sabbath. Now then, let's read it. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. Now then, John Rittenbaugh does not assume that this is a Passover, and he also assumes that this is probably the Passover of the second month. But let's understand something very important here. This does not say the second month. The reference we have is the first day of the 10th day of the first month. And everything else flows from that right down to here. So the 14th day then is the 14th day of the first month. That's when the Passover was to be kept. That's when they kept the Passover. That's what it says. It doesn't say the second month. And something is very interesting here. When you look in the Scriptures, wherever it talks about the Passover occurring in the second month because of the judgment in Numbers 9, it always states that they kept the Passover in the second month. So since it doesn't state it, we cannot assume that this is the Passover of the second month. This is the Passover of the first month, because the flow of the days lead right to it. Now let's notice. Verse 11. And they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day. Now, that unfortunately doesn't convey things as clearly as it could. Now let me read to you from the Septuagint of that section there. Joshua 5 and verse 10. And the children of Israel kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even, or at evening, on the westward side of Jordan, on the opposite side of the Jordan in the plain. They ate the grain of the earth. Now, it doesn't say that it was old, but it could be, because when they captured on the east side of the Jordan, they obviously captured all the stores, all the food, everything that they had, so they could have old grain. But remember, they were not to eat of any grain, any at all, until that first wavesheaf offering had been waved. God strictly forbade them to eat any grain. So even if they confiscated it from the people that they conquered, they still couldn't eat it because the wavesheaf offering had not been given. Now let's notice. They ate the grain of the earth, unleavened, and new corn. Now, let me read from Owen's Analytical Hebrew. Verse 10. While the children or the people of Israel were encamped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains, and they ate the produce of the land on the morrow after the Passover. Now, since the Passover is the 14th, what is the morrow after the Passover? The morrow after the Passover has to be the 15th. And the only time that you have the morrow after the Passover, the 15th, is when the Passover falls on a regular weekly Sabbath. So here we have the scriptures which tell us very clearly that on the day after the Passover, that's when the wavesheaf offering had to be waved. Why did it have to be waved, though it doesn't necessarily tell us directly here that it was waved? The reason being is because we have the command of Leviticus 23, which says you are not to eat of any of the harvest of it. You are not to eat any grain, any bread, or any parched corn until that wavesheaf offering has taken place after you come into the land. So therefore, the wavesheaf offering had to be given on the morning of the 15th, the day after the Passover. You can come to no other conclusion. Now then, let's understand some of the other things concerning what happened from there, and then we will go analyze it a little bit more here. All right? Now it says, verse 12, and the manna ceased on the morrow when they ate the produce of the land, and there was not any more manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So therefore, they did not have to plant their harvest, did they? When they took over the fields, it was theirs. So when they harvested it, it was theirs. Now then, let's also understand something, as we'll see a little bit later on, but let me just mention it before we get there. Let's come back here to verse 11. Joshua 5 and verse 11. Parched corn in the selfsame day. Now, what is parched corn? That is green, fresh, newly harvested. You never take the old corn and parch it, unless, of course, you want puffed wheat or puffed rice or popcorn. Because to parch it then was to dry it out, so then it could be made into fine flour. Now we'll see that in a little bit, but let's follow this sequence along and let's understand what happened and how then they circled Jericho. Now let's begin right here in verse 12, Joshua 5. And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the grain of the land. Could be new or old. It says old corn here in the King James, but it means of the grain of the land, not differentiating between new or old. The new is differentiated by the parched corn. And the children of Israel, but the children of Israel did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him, with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord I am now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said to him, What says my Lord unto your servant? So this was obviously the one who became Jesus Christ. This was the Lord God manifesting himself in a visible form, so he was the captain of the host. Now, let's see what else happened here. Verse 12. After getting all the instructions of what to do, that they were to take the men of war, and they were to go around the city once, with the priest bearing the ark and blowing the trumpets, all the while they went around the city once. Now let's see when that started, because this relates back to the circumcision that took place. Let's begin here in verse 9 of Joshua 6. And the armed men went before the priest that blew the trumpet, and the rearward came the ark, that is, at the end, and the priest going on and blowing with the trumpets. And Joshua commanded the people, saying, You shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth until I bid you shout, then you shall shout. So the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going about it once, and they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. Now, why did they do that? Well, we have two things going on here. Those who were the men of war, those who were armed, could be that whole group of men which had been circumcised, going clear back into Egypt, and were from 60 years old down to just a little over 40. That could be a considerable number. So for them to walk around Jericho presented no problem for them, because they had already been circumcised 40 years before. Therefore, that means that the question of being able to fight or to present themselves or to walk around the city of Jericho was not encumbered by them being circumcised.